The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past needs no introduction. It is the third game in the franchise, the first on the Super Nintendo, and continues to rank highly on best all-time lists to this very day. Needless to say, be it past or present, A Link to the Past is about as universally praised as a game can be. Playing the Zelda titles in order, the most interesting aspect about A Link to the Past to me is the story. The game takes the player on a journey before the events of the first two games, rather than keeping the story running in a linear fashion. The instruction manual explains how the Triforce came to be, being a relic left behind by the creators of Hyrule, the gods of power, wisdom, and courage. Legend says the Triforce was hidden in the Golden Land by the gods themselves, and the artifact would give great power to whoever found it. Later, a gang of thieves led by Ganondorf, aka Ganon according to the manual, successfully opened a gate to the Golden Land and found where the legendary Triforce had been hiding. Once acquired, evil power began spilling from the Golden Land into Hyrule. The king then ordered the gate be sealed by the 7 wise men to stop the evil from spilling into the present realm. The Knights of Hyrule were able to successfully push Ganon and his men back into the Golden Land, which had since been transformed into the Dark World, while the wise men sealed the portal between the two realms. This battle and conclusion would come to be known as the Imprisoning War. From what I gather, portions of this tale have been changed or retconned, and perhaps not everything is the same as laid out in the manual or the opening crawl, but this is the way the story was presented back in 1991. Anyway, this then leads to the opening scene in the game. A wizard named Ganon arrives in Hyrule, and he wishes to unbreak the seal leading to the Dark World. After dismissing the king of Hyrule, Ganon captures the descendants of each of the 7 wise men and makes them vanish one by one. The last descendant is Princess Zelda, who calls out to Link for help in the middle of a rainy evening. She telepathically speaks to Link and advises Ganon is close to breaking open the wise men's seal to the Dark World, and she needs to be rescued. From here, the player is presented with one of the best tutorials I've yet played in a video game. After Link's uncle races out on some adventure, the player gains control of Link. A chest immediately grabs the player's eye, and inside is not a sword or shield, but rather a lamp. A guard won't allow Link to enter the castle though, but Zelda sends another message advising there is a secret entrance. The player is then forced to drop down a hole, a critical teaching moment for the rest of the game. Pits are not always traps, but rather a means to drop down into a new area. After arriving into the sewer of the castle, a clever way to introduce dungeons, Link finds his wounded uncle. The uncle offers Link his sword and shield, and the player is now ready to save the princess. After leaving the sewer area, the player climbs upstairs inside the castle walls and finally arrives at the castle proper. Soon, a map is obtained, and I welcome its return after its absence in Zelda 2. The player can also see the castle is not a single-planed labyrinth, but rather a tall structure with 5 stories. After obtaining the trusty boomerang, the player defeats a challenging enemy, obtains a new item called the Big Key, allowing Zelda to be freed from her cell. What happens next is an escort mission, although Zelda cannot take damage, which is nice. At first, the idea of massive backtracking doesn't sound fun. However, the dungeon layout is such that the path back is shorter thanks to good level design, meaning many screens and obstacles are now skipped. The next part of the escape is another common Zelda trope. An item recently obtained is necessary for the next part of the game. In this case, the lamp not only lights the area around Link, but can be used to light up lantern pots. This introduces the player to magic. That's right, the magic element from Zelda 2 returns, only Link doesn't cast spells. Instead, some items actually need magic to function. Last but not least, at the end of the dungeon is a simple block pushing puzzle, a Zelda staple. In addition to pushing, some items can be pulled, which is taught with a text box. The dungeon concludes at the sanctuary. What I love about this opening section is how many game mechanics are taught to the player in such a short amount of time, without it ever being overwhelming. From the inclusion of new features like magic items, layered dungeons, and pulling, to the basics like switching items and viewing the map screen, players are given a ton of information with a good mix of design and text boxes without being vague or misleading. Next, Zelda reveals she is the final piece needed wizard for Ganon to break the seal of the wise men, opening a passage to the Dark World. Zelda informs the only thing which can defeat the wizard is the legendary Master Sword. She instructs to seek out a village elder, who is a descendant of the wise men, for assistance on this quest. At this point, a waypoint is placed on the overworld map, guiding the player on where to go next. This is in stark contrast to the original game, which was completely devoid of waypoints and the player was left to discover locations on their own volition. While one's preference towards this edition may vary depending on one's preference on linearity, it does communicate clearly to the player how to progress. In either case, this village elder does not know how to obtain the Master Sword, but advises another elder should, and to ask around for his whereabouts. At this point, the player is in Kakariko Village and should talk to everyone, as a few places will be key for progression in the future, like the swordsmiths. Others contain helpful items like jars and nets, and one character knows where the elder is. Upon arriving at the descendant of the wise men, the player learns only one who has obtained the 3 pendants is able to wield the Master Sword. He then instructs the player to head east for the Pendant of Courage. The first part of the game then becomes fairly standard. Find the 3 pendants in the 3 dungeons and then retrieve the Master Sword. As expected, the first proper dungeon is relatively easy. The path forward is linear, with well-placed keys and locked doors guiding the player forward along a linear path. One isn't going to get lost. This is a good time to point out one of my favorite changes to the combat. Link is able to keep his sword in front of him after swinging. In the previous games, stabs or slashes would always retract, strictly limiting the time Link might do damage. In A Link to the Past, the player can leave the sword extended and then walk into enemies. While I didn't realize this while playing the first Zelda, I do think this simple inclusion would have vastly improved the swordplay in the first game, allowing for the adventure to be less frustrating to play. A Link to the Past also includes an optional hint system in the dungeons. Certain bricks will allow Link to communicate telepathically with the Elder, who offers hints about the current situation. After defeating the boss, the descendant of the wise men will give Link the Pegasus boots or shoes, allowing Link to dash. This serves 2 functions. First, it makes traveling faster and allows Link to dash through enemies thanks to the extended sword. It allows the player to just get where they want to go without dealing with enemies if rupees, magic powder, or health drops aren't needed at that particular moment. Second, it also allows Link to interact with certain objects in a new way. Assuming a player is carefully exploring every new location unlocked with each new item or ability acquired, a player should not only find the library, but notice a suspicious book sitting on top of a shelf. This book is used to translate certain stones. Without it, the stones are gibberish. With them, Link can read them. I'll touch on this later, but this footage of Link casually walking around the desert is actually important. A player is expected to notice this stone on an unreachable plateau and memorize its location. Forgetting about its existence will eventually stop a player's progress at a later point in the game. In any case, with the Book of Medora, Link can unlock the passage to the next dungeon and the next pendant. After defeating the boss, Link has just 1 pendant to go. What happens next is quite interesting. On the way to retrieve the 3rd pendant, Link is forced to enter the Dark World through a portal which opened up in Death Mountain. However, the 3rd dungeon isn't in the Dark World. One must use the magic mirror to return to the Light World and continue the quest. On my first playthrough, I was briefly stuck here, but the designers do offer a hint to the player in the form of an unnatural shape of grass forming a diamond. Sure enough, using the magic mirror here will allow progression. This is an important teaching moment in The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The game expects the player to memorize all of the locations in the Light World, such as that stone slab scene, which are not accessible, find a marker of some sort in the Dark World, and then magic mirror back to the Light World to access a ledge or cliff previously obscured. But back to Death Mountain. The 3rd dungeon introduces a new gimmick, crystal switches. These will raise and lower red and blue rocks. This will open or close off certain sections of the dungeon, adding a light puzzle element. These are used throughout the adventure too, and in increasingly more awkward positions, forcing the player to use some wit and timing to set them off in the correct way. More impressively, this dungeon is the first to utilize the element of height in a clever way. Up to this point, the designers have reinforced to the player the big key is needed to open the big chest, which contains a new item necessary for the rest of the game. In this dungeon, the big chest isn't accessible by any means. Switch panels in the floor prevent the player from making it to the chest. This means the player has to fall from a higher level down to a lower level and reach the correct spot. And this is where the dungeon layouts are elevated. Each floor is clearly shown, and there are grid lines. This gives the exact visual reference needed for players to drop down and land where they expect. This concept of crystal switches and dropping down pits is often repeated, and a firm grasp of both concepts is needed for a particularly delightful puzzle in the Ice Palace later on. After clearing the third dungeon, the player can finally visit the Lost Woods and retrieve the Master Sword. The village elder telepathically contacts Link and advises the Master Sword can deflect the wizard's evil powers. With the sword and clue now obtained, the player can make their way back to Hyrule Castle and finally face Ganon. Upon arriving, the player witnesses Ganon send Zelda off to the Dark World, and then he vanishes through a wall. This is another great teaching moment as it shows the player they can slash through some items hanging on walls. The player then battles Ganon, but right before victorious, the wizard vanishes, sucking Link back into the Dark World. The player then finds themselves on top of a great pyramid in the former Golden Land, and Link is informed he must win back the Golden Power, which I presume is the Triforce, and rescue the Seven Maidens, descendants of the wise men who created the seal, locking Ganon into the Dark World. At this point, the player has little choice but to head to the next dungeon, the Palace of Darkness. This dungeon features an enemy which cannot be defeated by normal means. It mirrors Link's movement, but opposite, and if Link stares him down, a flame attack is fired. As the game previously told the player armor enemies can be defeated with arrows, one should figure out to launch an arrow and then move the enemy into it. While not complex, it is touches like this which elevate A Link to the Past above its predecessors. Another touch I appreciate is how Pegasus boots can be used to dash off ledges and onto platforms. A Link to the Past doesn't feature any sort of jumping, but an arrow gently guides the player into exploring the concept. I also love how these enemies can be defeated using different strategies. After the original Zelda, I have been sort of programmed to use bombs sparingly. However, tossing a bomb here is how most would likely attack these beetle enemies, but this never occurred to me. Instead, I dash attack them, which works without using the limited resource. While not a big deal, I do like how different players might attack an obstacle in different ways, and both are correct solutions. Something I dislike about A Link to the Past are these buttons. Sure, finding them might be a fun diversion, forcing a player to lift every pot on the screen, for example, making sure a player is being diligent in the exploration aspect of the adventure. Anyway, pressing a button generally opens a door, but sometimes when a player steps off the button, the door will close. This means the player will need to push a block onto the button to keep it pressed. It honestly feels like a chore, and I can't think of a single instance where this was even remotely engaging. To be fair, later in the game, the player acquires the Staff of Samaria, which can generate blocks. These blocks are occasionally necessary to keep a button pressed. Perhaps the pushing mechanic could be considered a teaching moment, but they are just way too frequent regardless. Moving along, the Swamp Palace uses the concept of an alternate dimension in a unique way. In the Light World, a player can enter this odd building and drain the surrounding swamp. Upon entering the Dark World, the water level will remain the same, letting the player venture forth. Again, it isn't much of a puzzle, but is a nice diversion, keeping a player interested in actually traveling back and forth between the two worlds, and offers the player a reward for thinking critically. Speaking of the Swamp Palace, now is probably a good time to talk about my favorite aspect of A Link to the Past. There is a ton of diversity in these dungeons. It is something I didn't realize I was missing in the first two games. In retrospect, the overall dungeon structure in the first game was limited. Push blocks, bomb walls, defeat enemies. The only real difference between each was its color. Same goes for Zelda 2. While the dungeons had new tiles and colors, the overall structure of each was the same. There was a hidden wall and some pits to drop down, but that was it. This is not the case in A Link to the Past. Many dungeons feel completely different and unique. In the Swamp Palace, the player is constantly raising and lowering water, revealing new rooms to explore and new paths forward. It is a basic gimmick for sure, but it feels sufficiently different from other dungeons. Even the aesthetic has changed, with new sprites helping the entire area feel like a sewer system. The next dungeon is the Skull Woods. This dungeon feels like old ruins, slowly being taken over by nature. Even stranger, the player will need to drop drop down pits to access different areas, and the dungeon itself is not congruent, meaning the player will be crisscrossing the dungeon and then the overworld to progress. In the end, it is still a standard dungeon, but the player is forced to think about two different spaces and how they interact with each other to ultimately reach the final section. The fourth dungeon, Thieves Town, is more traditional. However, there is a moment where the player is forced to throw bombs. Thankfully, every time a player picks up new bombs, the game feels the need to remind the player bombs can be thrown, which is sort of obnoxious. You'd think after the player finally did throw a bomb, this message would stop, but it doesn't. The aforementioned Ice Palace is incredibly unique, featuring a whopping 8 floors, and instead of traveling up a tower, the player traverses downward. Another unique element are the ice floors. This is alright, it is hard to argue with the added diversity, right smack dab in the middle of the adventure, but the slippery floors make basic tasks like trying to go up or down stairs far more tedious than it should be. Misery Mire is another traditional dungeon, but the way to enter is worth exploring further. It is obvious where the dungeon entrance is thanks to waypoints on the map. However, to actually get to this point on the map requires the player obtain the flute. The flute acts as a warp tool in the light world, and there are 9 points of interest the player can visit. This is convenient. One point is Link's house, and nearby is a cave full of fairies. The fairies will restore 7 units of health, but more importantly, can be saved for later use. In order to store them, a player needs to talk to everyone in the Kakariko village. A boy gives the player a net and a man sells Link a jar. Using the net, the player can capture the fairy and then store it in the jar. Even cooler, the player doesn't even have to equip and use the fairy. After running out of hearts, the fairy will automatically heal Link and allow the player to resume. A second location is the Witch's Hut. She sells 3 different potions, a life potion for restoring health, a magic potion for restoring magic, and a cure-all, which restores both. These also take up a bottle space, and the player is limited to 4. Between the flute, fairies, and Witcher's shop, players are offered an efficient way to restock on restorative items before entering any dungeon. However, to actually acquire the flute is a slightly non-intuitive process. In the light world, there's a strange area in the forest where the ghost of a boy plays a song to some forest creatures. In the dark world, the character gives Link a shovel and requests he dig around and locate the flute. Once obtained, the NPC will instruct the player to play the flute in front of the weather vane. This unlocks the warping properties of the flute. Unfortunately, unless one happens to ask the right NPC at the right time, playing the flute in front of the weather vane seems obscure, yet it's required to gain access to the 6th dungeon. As one can see, in the Dark World there is no way to just walk into the swamp area. The player must arrive there via the Light World, and then find a portal to warp into the Dark World. If a player fails to find the flute and then upgrade its powers, a player is effectively stuck. Now, once at the entrance to the dungeon, the player should notice there is no entrance. Instead, there is a symbol of a lightning bolt. Finding the item shaped like a lightning bolt is the key to opening the entrance. So, how does one obtain this mysterious item? Well, when the player first visits Death Mountain, they'll have to notice there is a bridge off to the left of the Tower of Hera. The stone slab advises the Master Sword is needed to gain the magic of Ether. And of course, there isn't a lightning symbol here. The player has to remember at some point to return once the Master Sword is obtained to retrieve the magic. The problem is, there is no point between the Tower of Hera, where the player obtains the 3rd pendant, and Turtle Rock, where the player rescues the 7th maiden, where a player would ever need to venture up to Death Mountain, see the bridge, and remember, oh yeah, I can revisit that stone now. And this is my biggest gripe with The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. The overworld isn't very good. It starts off strong enough. Areas are gated off, preventing the player from wandering to locales that are not useful, and NPCs offer guidance, giving players meaningful direction for the quest at hand. But once the player obtains the Master Sword and defeats Ganon for the first time, the game reverts back to the Zelda 1 formula, where most locations are available to the player, and other than the numbered dungeons, little guidance is provided about where to go next. Now, I do understand some prefer this wide open approach and enjoy the rush from finally figuring out a cryptic secret. I really do understand, but I also can't help but appreciate the overworld design in Zelda 2. The player is restricted in where they can actually go. This limits the amount of towns to visit and people to talk to. Once an area is cleared, the player player earns an item that opens up the next, and the process repeats with the acquisition of the raft and flute. The player can of course always go back and revisit towns if they so choose, but the path forward feels like it was crafted with the player's experience in mind. Now, I'm not saying Zelda 2 is the only way to handle a large overworld in an adventure game, but I can't help but feel a solution might actually be found in A Link to the Past itself. The dungeons have an awesome map system. The player can always see where they have been. Once the map is found, the player can see where they haven't been. And once the compass is retrieved, the end boss becomes a target on the map. The player can even see dungeon entrances, staircases, and the big chest. A Link to the Past's Overworld could have used a similar design approach. It would be awesome to see where the player hadn't been yet, for example, and if the interaction between the new abilities and the area of Hyrule not explored yet were more meaningful, a more thoughtful quest could have been crafted. Instead, A Link to the Past has the player zigzagging all over Hyrule with little rhyme or reason in terms of dungeon location, making it extremely difficult for a player to memorize the entire Light World and Dark World layout and then hope the player returns at a later time when the proper item is obtained. It would have been awesome if some of these landmarks were noted on the map, giving the player a visual cue they might want to revisit the area if they haven't figured out its secret yet. Instead, the map sort of feels like a tech demo for Mode 7. The warped perspective offers a mild sense of depth, and it is neat to move around the zoomed-in view and watch the perspective shift. However, I would have preferred something more functional. Other Super Nintendo hardware tricks are present as well. Most obvious is the lighting and transparency effects when in a dark area with the lantern. It is a staple of the hardware for sure, and this is as good of use for it as any. The trademark pixelation effect is put to good use as well. Striking a berry when they are electrified harms Link, and the pixelation effect is a dramatic way to represent this is a bad thing for the player to do. Outside of the effects, the overall art direction is awesome. Perhaps it's my nostalgia for 16-bit graphics in the 90s, but I think this game is beautiful. Link is adorable, with his stumpy legs moving faster than the amount of ground covered. I don't get the pink hair, but whatever. Enemies are generally well animated, with different sprites depending on which direction they are facing. I like how floating enemies have shadows, doing a decent job simulating their place in the world. Actually, the entire 3D aesthetic is done convincingly. While not quite isometric, the game does a great job layering sprites and tiles, cluing the player in as to when they are up high and when they are on the ground level. And of course, the art style is beautiful. My favorite is perhaps the bullseye design of the trees. Using just 2 colors, the artists were able to make the tree look spherical, yet hand-drawn. The entire game follows this simple approach. The world is filled with detail, yet never cluttered. And because the designers went for a more whimsical style, the land of Hyrule is still visually appealing to revisit, rather than feeling dated. The music has aged wonderfully as well. The opening track, while Link is trying to break into the castle, is tense and dark, with sharp violins, like a horror movie. The classic Zelda Overworld music sounds as epic as ever, thanks to the new sample-based music chip. While not as full as a real orchestra, it still manages to feel epic. The Kakariko village has an almost quaint quality to it, like the player has stepped back into a simpler time. The Lost Woods has a mysterious yet upbeat quality to it, helping the player to feel excited that soon they'll be able to take the sword out of the stone and go on an amazing adventure. The boss theme is intense and fast, helping the battle feel exciting. At every point in the adventure, the music manages to set the proper mood thanks to thoughtful compositions and expert instrument selections. If there was one aspect of this game I would consider timeless, this is it. But back to the 6th dungeon. It is another mostly generic dungeon, although it does have a clever puzzle involving pushing blocks, lighting lantern pots, and using the map system to understand when to fall down a pit. Dungeon 7, Turtle Rock, again returns to the non-traditional level structure. The player needs to use the Staff of Samaria to make platforms move along tracks. The tracks might also loop above or below, adding a maze-like element to these minecart areas. Last but not least is Dungeon 8. Ganon's Tower. The lower area is claustrophobic and really harkens back to the dungeon style of the original game, but thanks to the map system, getting lost is nearly impossible, but battling through endless hordes of enemies and a boss rush is difficult, and the perfect way to wrap up the adventure. The final plot twist is also revealed during the boss of this palace. It turns out Ganon is actually Ganon. This leads to another cryptic set of events. During A Link to the Past, time does pass. Even at the beginning of the game, the sign in front of the castle says something completely different before Link saves Zelda compared to after. I assume this is supposed to be a clue characters might say and do different things at different points as well. I believe a player is expected to talk to all of the characters in the overworld multiple times, to hopefully reveal new clues as time passes. There is also a fortune teller who will occasionally drop hints if paid money. Although on my recorded run, I never bothered, as the information gathered was often pointless or vague, and thus a waste of rupees. In fact, there's a ton of text in the game I've never seen before, and I can't help but wish the overworld was structured in a way where I would have actually visited all of these people offering this wonderful advice, instead of not. Now, while I have been somewhat harsh in my critique up to this point, I want to make the following point as clear as I possibly can. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is an amazing game. I love how many concepts are taught to the player rather than explained via text box. Ganon runs into his quarters and the player has to slash through curtains to follow. This slashing to reveal a path is later used in the Skull Woods. Lighting lantern pots is intuitive as the player is stuck in a room with nothing but a chest and a mysterious looking pot, and one item outside of the sword. The skill is later used to solve puzzles and expanded upon with the fire rod, forcing the player to figure out how to light these temporary torches from a distance. I like how there are a few humorous elements in the game, like Link initially turning into a bunny in the Dark World, a representation of his innocence and goodness. The jar maker makes fun of the fact Link holds objects up into the air, perhaps an overreaction to obtaining a new item. A signpost tells the player to leave the middle-aged man alone. It isn't much, but I appreciate an occasional break in the seriousness of the crumbling Hyrule. I also love how this game offers plenty of optional content, which helps make replaying the game more enjoyable. Extra heart containers are now broken into smaller heart pieces, with 4 equaling a full life point. This does a wonderful job making many areas in Hyrule significantly less barren, and will certainly give completionists or 90s kids with nothing else to do all summer a fairly beefy side quest to complete. Other optionals include the magic cape, which turns Link invisible and immune to enemies at the cost of magic. This is useful for avoiding annoying enemies and other hazards. There is also the Cane of Burna, which is another immunity item using magic, but can inflict touch damage to nearby enemies. Finally, if a player finds they have too many rupees, they can upgrade both their arrow count and bomb count, allowing both items to be abused to a much greater extent. I like when optional items are hidden in obscure ways. When mandatory items are elusive or cryptic, not so much. Overall, while I may not find The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past to be the greatest game of all time, it is still a terrific title. The dungeon crawling really is amazing. The variety, and not just visually, but the massive changes between open, non-linear designs to tightly scripted areas filled with enemy encounters are a massive leap over the previous games, and I found them just as engaging the second time around as I did the first. The combat is also superior and feels fast and fluid, rather than stiff and restricted. The slashing maneuver has a much longer range, can be charged, and I found myself running into enemies far less frequently than in the first Zelda. And of course, the enemy freezing boomerang and the projectile deflecting shield return, adding depth to the combat. While I do have quibbles with some of the design choices, like the careless overworld, how the story basically stops after the first third of the game, and how some required items are too cryptic to find, the game still exhibits a high degree of polish, and there were moments where I sat back and smiled at some of the cleverness the designers packed in here. If for some reason you're like me and haven't knocked A Link to the Past off your backlog, this one is easy to recommend. The difficulty is never insane, there are a few technical issues to speak of, the game is visually pleasing, and the soundtrack is amazing. While not perfect, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is still a wonderful game.